are taking you through the journey of India's banking sector so far. There have been pockets of struggle, plenty of good growth coming thanks to a democratic dividend, but suddenly all of that is nearly under a spotlight. Why? Because the non-performing assets are up and banks are now turning conservative. The sector is under scrutiny and things ahead promise to be much harder. But Citibank's Pramit Jhaveri remains confident that the growth rate will not slow down much further. He assures us that while sector is seeing a slight growth in restructured loans, non-performing assets continue to remain at manageable levels, and if our vast manpower is optimally used, it could be the trigger we need to return to a growth trajectory.
Pramit, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The state of India is getting everyone a bit worried. But what I want to ask you specifically is whether you think the Indian banking sector is going to be a victim in this slowdown.
I don't think so. I don't believe the answer to that is yes. I mean, at the end of the day, the Indian banking industry has had a very good run over the last decade or so, right? And if you look at the growth that it's benefited from, it's really a consequence of the underlying growth in an economy. That's true for the banking system anywhere in the world. I think if you have to contend with slightly lower growth rates over the next few years, so the banking industry will grow at slightly less than it has grown in the past, right? And
how less is less?
And if there are problems in the real economy, related to excessive leverage or related to non-performing assets, they will in some way pass themselves onto the banking system. So yes, it will not be as wonderful a run as we've had in the last 10 years, but I think there are also some compensating factors like underlying growth, the need for infrastructure, more and more people coming into the banking net. So I think it would be an exaggeration to say it will be a victim of the industry,
sure,
but it may have suffer some consequences.
But we're looking at a consumption story that I think large number of people are considerably bullish on still. So why is it that one expects the banking sector to not do as well as it has over the last 10 years? Are we saying that corporate India will be truly the drag on the sector?
You could say that in the medium term, the banking industry will have some challenges. Okay. And I think one of the issues is going to be from a long-term point of view, how is the banking industry going to fuel the needs of this country, long term? Where is the capital going to come from?
Do you see the challenges almost similar for both private and public sector banks, or do you see them particularly different from a restructuring assets point of view and the exposure to large corporations that are in trouble today?
Well, first of all, the state-owned banking sector is yet 75% of this industry. And at this point, I think the government has made it very clear that it does not intend to reduce its ownership in its state-owned banks. So if those banks need to grow at the rates that we would like to see them grow, then the governments are obviously going to have to follow with infusions of capital so as to allow it to retain its ownership and allow the bank, that segment to grow. I think the private sector has benefited from wonderful valuations, and that has allowed it to raise capital, and fuel the growth. I think the question is going to be, how are we going to be able to continue to fuel that growth by raising capital and retaining the returns that the industry would like to see it?
The finance minister this time minced no words about how concerned he was about the NPA problem or the non-performing asset issue within banks. Do you think that it's slightly exaggerated as a fear, or do you think that NPAs will become a big issue, at least over the next 3 quarters till we settle?
I don't think it's fair to make a generalization across either corporate India or across the banking system. But I think there are pockets of excessive leverage that are going to find themselves into the banking system, and the banking sector is going to have to digest them, is going to have to deal with them, is going to have to restructure them. And, some of that is real.
Restructure isn't another garb for non-performing assets, is it?
Well, at the end of the day, I think any institution has to look at a asset or a particular set of assets and take a very objective view of whether this is really an NPA or whether this is really restructurable.
Yeah.
And I think right now in India, what one does see is a blurring of the distinction between the two, which is not necessarily the best thing.
Actually, that's going to make it harder for banks to make that distinction because they are the ones who really need to then restructure and take it ahead. Let's take this discussion to what will drive banking in today's environment. Would it be the retail segment, or would it be investment banking? Because if one does see corporations hesitate to spend, then somewhere the whole corporate commercial banking story is going to slow.
I think it's really going to be a consequence of our consumption drivers that we spoke about. I think it's going to be the needs of kind of investment and infrastructure. And then I think as more and more people get brought into the banking net, right, that will be an opportunity for the banking system to grow. So I think all of those kind of lend themselves to growth. I think you have to just find a way to grow in a calibrated manner, but also find a way, because the world is now going to be acutely conscious on returns that you can generate.
Absolutely, which is where I was going to come to. What is consumer confidence? I mean, if you are so heavily into the retail side, credit cards and so on, what is the feedback you're getting from your own departments? Do they get a sense that the consumers out there are willing to spend like the way they have over the last few years, driving that consumption boom?
The percentage of India that is already in the banking net from a retail banking point of view, it's very small.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that base is going to keep growing. I think the second thing is, to answer your specific question, it is very analogous to corporate India, right? So 10 years ago, corporate India, we talked about the global corporate. Today, when you look at the segments of retail banking that we're focused on, right? So we're talking about savings, investments, globalization. You're talking about the global Indian. You're talking about the Indian who wants to invest overseas, who wants money overseas for leisure and travel. You're talking about NRIs who want to invest back in India. I mean, culturally and philosophically, Indians have always tended to be at a individual, retail, or household level more debt averse than individuals anywhere in the world. And that's actually a good thing for the banking industry.
As a banker, that the RBI could help the economy and the consumption story in a big way by consistently bringing interest rates down?
Well, interest rates are a very complex subject, and it's not just about helping the banks. At the end of the day, there is a much broader issue. But I think right now what you will find is that interest rates have obviously increased over the last 2 years quite significantly, which pretty much is the raw material for banks, and therefore it does start kind of eating into your margins. And as we potentially and hopefully enter a kind of declining interest rate cycle, the question is going to be how much of that transmission is going to take place and how quickly. And that's what the central bank is going to be focused on.
But you don't get a sense that having seen a cut earlier this year in CRR, that 2012 is probably not the year where macroeconomics allow for another rate cut?
Well, I think in the very early part of the year, you would have probably got a much broader consensus that 2012 will be the year in which we will see interest rate declines or interest rate cuts, right? I think as we stand today, for a variety of factors and challenges, that is no longer so obvious. And, I think you will yet find kind of pockets in India who would, like to believe that there is an environment and a possibility of cuts. But I think, the sense, and the Reserve Bank has been fairly open about that, they're going to be much more cautious about that at this stage.
And that's how every bank will also have to approach it.
Well, as I said, it's a question of transmission, because eventually, the cut is you've got to see that transmit into the real kind of economy.
Pramit, thanks very much. Appreciate that perspective.
Thank you very much.
After this, we're going to travel straight to ICICI Bank and catch up with KV Kamath and find out whether he thinks these macroeconomic factors, if kept aside, we will still find the story of growth on track. We'll catch up with him ahead.